My name is James. Welcome to King's Fun Woodworking. Today I am going to build a project that was incredibly fun for us. This is a solid Lignum Vitae Thor's hammer mallet. It's a life-size replica of the movie prop from Thor, and it's not a woodworking mallet. This thing is a beast. It weighs in at over 11 pounds. Since large blocks of Lignum Vitae are almost impossible to source, I had to start with these blocks here. These things are 3 inches thick by 1 foot long, and we're going to basically plane these things down or joint these things flat on one side and then cut them square and plane them square, and we're going to build up the mallet head from these. If you haven't done so in the past, we would really appreciate it if you would take the time to just click subscribe and subscribe to our channel. And if you hit that bell notification below also, that will notify you of upcoming videos that we have as they come out, and we basically have a lot of projects planned for this summer. It's going to be a really packed year for us. So after we get 2 sides square from the jointer, we're going to take this over to the table saw and we will rip and get the other 2 sides nice and square. And here's the final side getting squared up right now. So one thing about lignum is it's a very oily wood. So if we were to just take our glue and glue these boards together at this point, there is a good possibility that they would come apart down the road sometime. It might not last that long at all. So what we'll do is we'll take acetone and we will clean off the oils from the surface of this wood before we glue it up. And that way we'll have oil-free wood for the glue to make a proper bond. And so there, my daughter Maya just marked where we're going to glue those pieces together. We're going to do this glue up in 2 steps. First, we're going to glue 2 pieces together, and then another 2 pieces together, and then we're going to glue them finally all together in one big block. I like to put glue on both sides of the wood to make sure that we have an adequate bond and sufficient amount of glue. It's probably a little bit more glue than is necessary, but all of the extra glue will squeeze out due to clamp pressure, and I know there'll be no shortage of glue here. Another thing that we're doing is we're putting this together in a single set of clamps. That just saves clamps and saves time. Although there's no glue technically in the middle, we're just gluing a pair of boards on the left and a pair of boards on the right. In here, we're going to take a minute to put a clamp in at the seam to make sure that when these 2 boards get their pressure from the big parallel clamps, they'll stay nice and flat together. So the DeWalt bar clamps are just clamped on relatively lightly, but enough to hold the other 2 boards flat. Then we can go ahead and load them up with parallel clamps and clamp everything down nice and snug. Once this is all done, we're going to take a minute, clean off some of the excess glue, whatever we can reach, with a damp cloth. I'm not really too worried if any extra stays on there because we're going to plane it off when we're all done. And then we're going to let this thing sit up overnight. With the clamps off, we're going to take these block pairs that have been glued together, and I'm going to take them over to the jointer, and I'm going to get one side perfectly flat. And then we can glue the 2 block halves together. Not sure if you can see the striping that's occurring there on the top of that, where the clamps were kind of blocking some of the light or the heat that was coming in there, but that's what happens to lignum over time. It turns really quite green, and sometimes under pressure or under intense UV light or even just sunlight it turns green. So slowly over time the head of this mallet and the handle, which is lignum also, will turn quite green. And so here we are, we're just going to glue these 2 block halves together nicely and then clamp them up. And you should have noticed I did clean them with acetone before I applied the glue. Same principle there. I figured some oils had made it back to the surface from the previous cleaning, so I wanted to give it one more clean with acetone. And once we get this clamped up, we'll take a second and try to clean off some of the excess glue that has squeezed out. And we're going to let this sit up overnight as well. So now we can turn our attention to the handle. This was a 2" by 2" by 24" piece of lignum that we started with the handle, and the first step is just to get it turned generally round. My daughter does most of the turning in the shop, but she wasn't available today, so I went ahead and turned the handle for this project. So once I've got it turned round, then I'll start with 100 grit paper, and I'll work my way down to 220 grit. And then it's time to mark the locations of the cuts that are going to go on here for the different parts of the handle, and you'll see how that goes here in just a minute. Alright, once I have those locations marked, I'm going to need to turn them down to a very specific amount. We're going to take them down to exactly 1 1/4 inches. The hole that's going to be inside of the collar that goes under the head is 1 1/4 inches, and the hole that goes through the head is 1 1/4 inches. So I've got to get this down to an exact amount. I'm using the calipers to check there and make sure that's fine-tuned. Then I'm going to need to do the same thing on the bottom end of the hammer handle here. There's a little pommel that we're going to put on the end there, and the hole that's going to go inside of that is also going to be 1 1/4 inches. We're going to make those out of Padauk, African Padauk. This is a piece of old growth African Padauk here. It's a really deep dark red, and I think it has a beautiful grain to it, so hopefully it looks really good when we're done. I'm going to start with a piece that's 3 inches thick, and of course the first thing is to turn it into a round shape. This is actually a project for a customer, so we took the time to get a couple of species of woods that I thought matched really well together. Once I get it round, I'm going to put a little dovetail end on one side so that I can put this into a chuck. That's going to allow me to get a good grip on it and turn it down into a smaller size here. And now I've got the chuck mounted, you can see on the left hand side, and at this point we'll be able to turn the different pieces that we need off of this. So now I'm turning the bell-shaped pommel that's going to go onto the end of the hammer, and this is the general shape that we use for most of our mallets. Of course, for our mallets we don't typically use a separate species of wood for this, but I thought for this big hammer this would look really good. And then of course it's time to drill it. So that's the main reason why I had to put this into a chuck on the other side so that it could support itself, or the chuck could support it so that we could send the drill bit in. The drill bit's got to be our 1 1/4 size drill bit so that the handle that we just turned to that diameter will fit perfectly inside of this. And when you're drilling a hole this big and a piece this size, it's a good idea to go slow and continually back out and pull the extra sawdust out. And then it's time to cut it off on the other side. I'm going to get down as close as I can with my parting tool. And I've got my hand on it in case it breaks off, but I actually would rather finish it with a saw. I don't have a whole lot of skill with the parting tool here, so I feel more comfortable cutting off the last little bit with my Japanese saw. And there it is. We'll take a look at that, and it seems to be a pretty good fit. So I think that's going to look great together. Next I'm going to turn the collar. This is just a little collar that goes on the handle right at the top just before the head, and I'm just kind of free-forming a shape here. It snatched the sandpaper away from me. I don't think it wanted to be sanded, but just kind of a free-form shape. I didn't really have anything specific in mind. I was just trying to turn something that I thought would look nice. And of course the same deal here. I need to drill this with my 1 1/4 drill bit there so that my handle will slide through it. I do have the back of that turned down a little bit smaller than the drill bit. You can see as it broke through, it freed the piece off for me, so I didn't have any extra work sanding or fitting that. And we'll just carefully take it off there. That looks pretty good, and then I'll do a quick test fit and make sure that it goes on the handle. And it looks like that fits pretty nice. I think that's going to work great. I just want to take a second to mention our community group. We have a Kings Fine Woodworking community group on Facebook. That's a closed group that's all for woodworkers. It's woodworkers helping other woodworkers with questions, answers, and problems they might have, and it's a good place to show off your work. If you're interested in joining, I'll put a link to that in the description below. All right, once that's dried and has come out of clamps, it's time to process this. That's quite a big, hefty piece there. So the first thing we'll do is we're just going to start by flattening it. Maya is jointing it there flat on one side, and then when she's done, she'll rotate at 90 degrees and get another edge square to that. We always check to make sure that those corners that we joint are, in fact, nice and square. It's a good idea to regularly check the jointer, bed, and fence to make sure that those are square as well. And once we've got a couple of sides square, we can send this through the planer to get the opposing sides parallel to the first. That is going to give us a perfectly square cross-section here to work with. Then it's time to take it over to the chop saw and cut it to length. Of course, this big beast is 5.5 inches thick, so it's far too thick to chop it in one pass, so we're just going to have to rotate it. And what you can do to line that up, if there's no laser on your saw, it really doesn't make any difference. I just line it up so that I can push the blade down into the groove a little bit, cut again, rotate 90 degrees, and just repeat. That will generally give you a cut on the end that's practically perfect, so much so that all you would need is a little bit of light sanding, maybe to clean it up. So we started by squaring one side, and now I am actually cutting the other side here to length so that this is going to end up being the complete head size. After that, we're going to take this over to the table saw, and this is a relatively safe operation, and that's only because it is such a big cross-sectional area here. I have the blade up just high enough, which is probably about 5/8 or 3/4 of an inch to cut the corner of it off here, and I have a pretty big, flat, stable surface area, about 25 square inches on the end, or almost 30 square inches, I guess, on the end of the block. So I can cut the corners off by doing it this way. And I don't really have any fear of kickback, or like the big piece jumping back at me, just simply because it weighs over 10 pounds, so it's just a big heavy piece. It's not going anywhere. And that's what that looks like for the first part of the cuts here. And for the next step, I will lay it on its side, and I will cut these corners off at 45 degrees. If this is something you think you might want to build, I have free plans for this on the website. And I'll actually put a link to that in the description below. It's a really fun build. You don't have to build it out of lignum, of course. There it is after the second set of cuts. You can build out of anything. You can build out of dimensional lumber. Finally, I've created a little jig here that's going to allow me to cut the very corners off. The jig is going to hold it at 90 degrees, or I guess 45 degrees to the fence in this case, but keep it vertical at 90 and allow me to just chop those corners off like that. So it's starting to look a little bit more like the Thor's hammer. And then lastly, I have the blade raised up about 1/8 of an inch, and I'm going to roll over all the surfaces right at that corner junction where the angle or the bevel meets the flat. And in just a second here, you'll see what this is going to look like. And what this does is it really cleans up all of those edges and makes it look a lot more uniform. And that's what that looks like there. Looks a little bit neater than having all those angles just kind of fall into the flats. And then we'll just take a few minutes to sand the whole piece. I'll start with the end grain here. You usually got to do something a little coarser with that. Whenever you sand lignum, it's pretty oily, so you kind of go through a lot of sandpaper because it gets clogged up with oil. But if you sand any other species, it's really not too bad. Since everything was cut on a table saw or hit the joint or a planer, it's really pretty smooth. Then once that's done, it's going to be time to drill the hole. So I'm just going to make a little mark from corner to corner, get my center point, and put my 1¼ drill bit back in here. It's the same one I used to cut the holes in the pommel at the end and the collar. And we'll drill that in about as far as it can go. And then, unfortunately, it's not far enough to go all the way through, but they do make extensions. So I have a little extension collar on the drill bit now that I've attached to allow me to get the rest of the depth all the way through the piece. Alright, and with that gets all the way through, and once I turn it off I will have to lower the table to get this out because the drill press doesn't have quite enough throw for me to raise it all the way back up. And that's it. We can see that's drilled all the way through the head there. So we'll give it a little test fit and see how it goes. And we should be just a little bit shy of the top, which we are. That's perfect. And that's going to allow me to put a round disc on the top and it won't be interfered with by the handle. So we're just going to quickly put everything together, a little dry fit, and see if everything looks good before we glue it up. And there it is. That looks pretty good. I don't think I'd want to swing that around, but that's pretty cool. Alright, so we're going to put a wedge in this to kind of hold this in. I know it's not really going to be used as a hammer, but you know, just in case, we're gonna build it as if it is so it can handle it. And then the next step before the glue up, of course, is to clean everything with acetone once again. Oils have probably made it back to the surface, even if some of these areas have been cleaned, and of course some have not yet been cleaned. And this will get all of the excess oils off so that we get a good strong glue bond. So I will do as I do for all of my joinery, and I will put glue on all of the mating surfaces. I'll just a little bit more than I need, and then we'll clean off any excess kind of as we go along here. And you can see there's actually no excess there at all. That was just exactly the right amount of glue. And here's the wedge. We did clean that with acetone as well. And we'll drive that down into the handle, which kind of wedges the handle apart real tight so we get a real snug fit in there. Kind of gives the glue some extra bond strength, and even if this were to get used as a hammer, it would never come apart at this point. So you can see here we've actually got to squeeze the air out of there because it's such a good fit. We're kind of getting some compression in there, but eventually it gives way and seats. And so we'll go ahead and we'll just clamp the bottom of this on for maybe an hour or so before we resume and cut the top part. So on the Thor's hammer, which is a movie prop, there's a round disc at the top of the hammer, and although this certainly is not an exact movie replica, we're just going to go ahead and mimic this part as well, get it a little bit closer to what the movie prop looked like. And this kind of ties the hammer together nicely too by getting some Padauk at the top. So we're just going to turn the disc on the lathe. It's actually my daughter turning it here, and she's just turned one side flat and she's going to cut the disc off. It typically works best if you've got a cutoff tool and you're going into a tight spot. If you're going pretty deep, we usually make the cut a little bit wider than the cutoff tool, maybe twice as wide as the cutoff tool, and that way it gets in there and cuts a little easier. And you can see how the Padauk shreds quite a bit. So we will basically do some sanding. That's important, especially for Padauk. And she'll just go ahead and cut this off with a saw as well. And we took the time to sand it a little bit off camera to make sure both sides were nice and flat. Get rid of any tool marks on there. And we're just going to glue this in place. I'm going to hold it here for about 30 to 45 seconds until it gets a little bit of tack and doesn't move. And make sure it's centered by eye. I didn't really measure. We just got it visually centered. And we give it a clamp. And we're going to go ahead and let this sit overnight as well. So it's had a chance to cure overnight. The hammer is now fully built and assembled, and it looks pretty nice. It's definitely a beast, a big heavy thing here. So what we do after that is we sand it fully. After the whole thing has been sanded, we take it down to about 220, 280, sometimes 320 grit. Really depends on the species. And then we go over the whole thing and clean off all of the fine dust particles with alcohol, denatured alcohol. That's the best thing to get those off with, especially the Padauk. The Padauk leaves a lot of red dust, so it's important to get all of that off. And I like to use spray lacquer. That's what this is here. Maya is spraying this for us. This is Deft spray lacquer, and it works great. This piece ended up taking 5 or 6 coats total. We sanded lightly after the second coat, and then we gave it a finish sand of 2000 grit after the very last coat. And this is really more of a polish to just make it super smooth at the end. It works really nice. If you have ever ordered one of our hammers and you felt the finish on it and you know what we're talking about, this is the secret to get it perfect. Once we've done that with 2000 grit, then we go over and we pull all the very fine dust off by rubbing it really hard with a tack cloth. This gets it even smoother, and it leaves a teeny little bit of wax on there, which we will buff off with a clean cotton cloth. And that's all there is to it. So that project is finished. Let's take a weight of this thing, and this came in at a whopping 11 pounds and 2 ounces. So it's definitely a beast of a hammer. And we sent it off to our customer after this, and he seemed to really like it. He made a little place for it in his shop and sent us a photograph. And so that wraps up today's project. I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for watching.